I'm very excited to welcome you all to this special event this afternoon. It's really a double header. It's both the Dean's Social Science Lecture for the spring quarter, and also the inauguration of a very exciting program, which is sponsored by the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy. The Blum Center's director, that's Alice O'Connor, professor of history, and Joanne Nowak, who's the academic coordinator of the center, have been doing an absolutely fabulous job in raising up the very important work of the Blum Center in addressing what seems to be a absolutely central issue of our times. That is the deepening inequality in the United States and globally, and how that affects the experience of a democratic life. And I'm so pleased that the Blum Center has become a vibrant unit of our campus, and it's fitting that this very exciting initiative should be sponsored and housed in the Blum Center. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Professor O'Connor to speak about the center and about this initiative. Alice.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me echo Dean Hale in welcoming everyone to this opening event in the Blum Center's really exciting new initiative on cooperative economics. I want to acknowledge the faculty and others who are serving on the advisory committee for the initiative. Utacha Chattopadhyay, who is from the history department, Diane Fugino from Asian American Studies, and Casey Walsh from the Department of Anthropology at UCSB. I also want to acknowledge Nick Cohen, who's a graduate student in history who is providing research and related assistance for the initiative. And I especially, as always, want to thank Joanne Nowak, the Blum Center's academic coordinator, who continues to provide vital, substantive, and administrative support, and really sustained institutional leadership for all of our efforts at the Blum Center. I also want to thank the Awasti family and Philip White, who have provided critical financial support for planning and launching this initiative. The Cooperative Economics Initiative builds on the core mission of UCSB's Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, which is to foster community-engaged research, teaching, learning, and public conversation about poverty and intersectional inequality as problems that we understand as to be structurally and historically rooted, but also sustained by political regimes that have grown visibly more undemocratic over the past several decades, not just in their increasingly overt efforts to suppress the political voices of working class communities of color, but in their systemic privileging of the interests of publicly subsidized but privately held corporate and individual wealth over the shared public interest in an equitable society that advances the well-being of everybody. But more than identifying and framing poverty and inequality as problems of democracy, which they are, we also aim to inform thought and action and conversation about what a more just, equitable, and environmentally sustainable future actually looks like, and how we get there through exercising collective democratic voice. And that's where the initiative in cooperative economics comes from. That's where it comes in. It starts from the recognition that this is a vast and varied, historically rooted, and really a vibrant field of economic activity that has many prominent examples in California, right here on the Central Coast, locally in Santa Barbara, many prominent examples in the United States and worldwide. And that at their core, these varied endeavors, at their core is the commitment to principles of democratic ownership and control, and to prioritizing the needs of members and of the communities that they serve over the maximization of profit. So among the aims of our initiative is to seed a new generation of research, specifically research by UCSB students and faculty on cooperative economics, but hopefully research that will definitely research that engages the community in that ongoing enterprise of collective knowing and collective understanding. Toward that end, we have announced the first of what will be an annual small grants competition that will support both independent student and faculty directed team research projects on a range of topics related to cooperative economics. So if you take a look in the chat box, you'll see Joanne has provided a link to the actual call for proposals. That call is in circulation. It's also on our website. The due date for proposals is May 21st. The grant periods will begin this summer. So I encourage you all to take a look, think about it, get together with others and propose. In addition to today's keynote address by Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, which we're very excited about, it's a perfect way to launch this initiative, we will also be sponsoring a follow-up workshop. It's a workshop that will be designed around the interests of students and faculty and community members who are thinking about developing research projects or otherwise exploring some aspect of cooperative economics. And we'll really get down to some of the nuts and bolts of how to go about doing research, but how research can play both a collaborative and a productive and constructive role in the project of cooperative economics. We'll be announcing further details about that workshop, but for now, please mark your calendars for Thursday, May 6th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is when we'll be holding the workshop. So with that, and before I turn it back to Charlie to introduce Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, our speaker, I want to say a couple of things about today's program and the way it will go. First, again, let me reiterate, please turn off your cameras and set your Zoom to speaker view so that we can get a better view of the presentations. Following the keynote, we will have an exchange with a panel of discussants, including Elvia Cruz Garcia, Marcelina Sepulveda, and Chris McCauley. I will introduce them more formally just before the panel starts. We'll have an exchange with the panel, and then after that, we'll be opening up the floor for Q&A. To facilitate that, we ask that you pose your questions in the chat box, and then we'll gather and pose them when the time comes. So with that, let me say once again, thanks a lot for everyone for coming and for your interest and for participating. And I'll turn it back to Charlie for the introductions of the keynote.
Thanks, Alice. Welcome everyone who wasn't here at the beginning when we said welcome. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon. After a long hibernation brought on by the pandemic, we're now today reinitiating the Social Science Dean's Lecture Series, which brings to campus 3 times a year a prominent scholar in the social sciences whose work speaks to a broad array of disciplinary and post-disciplinary interests in our division, and in so doing advances our mission. I couldn't imagine a more apt fulfillment of this mandate than the lecture we're about to hear by Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. Equally important, as Alice has just explained, Dr. Gordon-Nembhard's lecture inaugurates a new initiative in the study of cooperative economics, inspired by our faculty and student interests, by the convergent political work of community activists and organizations with whom we hope to partner, and by Anupam and Arti Awasthi, generous donors, and in the case of Arti Awasthi, a member of the Social Science Dean's Cabinet. Conversations with the Awasthis over the past 2 years helped to catalyze this initiative, conceived to honor U.S. Awasthi their father and father-in-law, who's the founder and managing director of IFCO, the largest cooperative, one of the largest cooperatives in the world, with around 35,000 member cooperatives reaching over 50 million Indian farmers. We are deeply grateful to Alice and to the faculty members who she named, who serve on the Cooperative Economic Steering Committee, for their able work in conceiving and launching this exciting initiative. Dr. Gordon-Nembhard is a political economist, professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies, John Jay College, City University of New York. She's the author of many works on community economic development and community-based asset building, solidarity economics, Black political economy, community-based approaches to justice, most prominently, Collective Courage, a history of African-American cooperative economic thought and practice, published in 2014, and the focus of extensive critical acclaim. Among her many other writings, I'm especially proud to note her essay, Theorizing and Practicing Democratic Community Economics, which appears in Engaging Contradictions, a 2008 volume on activist scholarship that I edited. This note also helps us to specify and appreciate the nature of the critical acclaim that Jessica's work has generated over the course of her career. Alongside formal academic credentials and accolades, Jessica has proffered her research and expertise to an extensive roster of cooperatives, of collectives mobilizing to form cooperatives, of organizations that support cooperatives as a means to advance economic and racial justice. Recognition of these efforts include her recent induction into the U.S. Cooperative Hall of Fame, and equally important, the immense gratitude of those in struggle for economic and racial justice who she has accompanied. A final reason for my pleasure in welcoming Dr. Gordon-Nembhard is my long association with her wonderful family. Her mother, a physician, educator, and activist. Her father, an eminent centenarian social psychologist. And her brother, an anthropologist who's been my mentor, colleague, dear friend, and steadfast compañero for the past 40 years. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us. Thank you for making this such a momentous occasion. Please, all of us, virtually in whatever way you know how, join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard to the lecture.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Charlie. And thanks for remembering my mom. And you're right, my dad will be 100 years old in June. So it's quite amazing accomplishments and a hard act to follow. But anyway, here I am. I do have a PowerPoint. So I think we're going to start that. Yes, as you know, my talk is called African American Cooperatives and Economic Justice. Next slide. And I do want to start by acknowledging, well, first thanking the Bloom Center and the Dean of Social Sciences, Charlie Hale. I also want to acknowledge, I need to do a land acknowledgement, acknowledge the original stewards, occupants of the land. I want to acknowledge my own ancestors and elders, and I want us to bring our ancestors into the room here with us. I also want to acknowledge struggles of enslaved laborers, all those who labor without just compensation, and acknowledge our claim to land and resources. And I want to acknowledge those fallen killed by police brutality and other forms of racism and anti-Blackness. Next slide, please. I want to start, especially since the Bloom Center is called the Center for Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy. I think I have that right. I want to start with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who hopefully you all know was an African-American intellectual and historian, as well as actually, I think he sort of started the field of urban sociology. He also was a poet, a novelist, and he also studied political economy in Berlin in the 1880s, I believe. And I've come across a lot of his writings actually about cooperative economics. And in 1907 in Atlanta, as part of his famous Atlanta conferences, the 12th Atlanta Conference was on cooperative economics, or what did he call it? Economic cooperation among Negro Americans. And the statement that came out of that conference, in addition to a book that he did on the topic, ends with this statement: "We unwittingly stand hesitating at the crossroads, one way leading to the old trodden ways of grasping fierce individualistic competition to get wealth at the expense of the general well-being. The other way leading to cooperation in capital and labor, the massing of small savings, the wide distribution of capital, and a more general equality of wealth and comfort." So I want to start there. Next slide, please. Because I believe we're still at that crossroads, or again at that crossroads, whichever way you want to say it. We're at a 21st century crossroads, right? We've talked about it already: the growing economic inequality, high income inequality, huge wealth gaps, poverty, gentrification. The old trodden ways are still being used but not working, right? We've been through the housing crisis, Trumpism, the COVID pandemic. And we need new strategies, or we need to choose a different route. Next slide, please. So I'm suggesting that we try the cooperative route, right? Take that fork in the road that Du Bois mentioned that we had the choice of. And one of the things I started to do, I guess it's like over 20 years ago now, was to look at the history of African-American co-op activity and economic cooperation. I was able to use that 1907 book from Du Bois, but I was also able to go, look at other things that from the 1700s on, and look at more 20th century activities as well. And one of the things, as I began to talk to community people about cooperative economics as a strategy, I often heard people say, "Oh, Black folks don't engage in cooperation, in cooperatives, right? We don't do co-ops. We don't do food co-ops. We don't do co-ops." It made no sense to me. I took it upon myself to start researching, and what did I find? I actually found a long legacy, a long and strong history of African-American economic thought and practice. After about 15 years, I finally decided I knew enough to publish a book on it, so I published the book. But what I learned was, and I don't really necessarily claim that it's only African Americans who have used cooperative practice in this way, but I did focus there because I am a faculty member in an Africana Studies department. And because I am a Black political economist, I've always been interested in what's happening with Black folks and Black community economic development. So that's where I focused. But you'll see, and I think, other groups can see, and I'm waiting for other people to do these histories to show that pretty much all subaltern groups have similar history of using cooperatives to gain economic justice and to further the development of marginalized people, the humane development of marginalized people. So we know, or we found out, that African-American co-op history has been a hidden history, right? Complicated by economic marginalization and thwarted by racial discrimination and white supremacist violence. But it's also been a thriving history of reaction to market failure and economic discrimination. Next slide, please. So there's the book. Next slide, please. I also, as I started to study the examples of African-American co-ops and economic cooperation, I found that these are really direct responses to alternative direct responses to market failure and discrimination. And these are alternative economic solutions for a group of people who were often, right, didn't even own our own bodies, didn't have access to land or capital to get access to land, often didn't have enough food to eat. And we found ways to kind of assert our human agency in the economic sphere and engage in all different kinds of mutual aid and economic cooperation. We used African retentions, a self-help ideology, and sometimes voluntary segregation, meaning very deliberately deciding to stay within our group and practice our economic activity within our own group so that we could control, right, have some self-determination about our economic activity. And we used co-ops and racial self-sufficiency to give us sort of that, not just survival, but that edge, a little bit of independence, a little bit more control over what was happening in our lives in situations where we had very little control in general. Also being engaged in cooperatives, and in a minute, I'll actually explain what cooperatives are in case everyone doesn't know, right? They also gave us a chance to design and manage needed goods and services in very culturally, racially, geographically sensitive ways that often, again, we weren't getting from the mainstream. Next slide. So as I said, co-ops were a way for survival, a survival mechanism, right? We used mutual aid, economic cooperation, often because we didn't have any wealth. We had no stored value. We didn't own our own bodies even during enslavement, and then after enslavement with Jim Crow and apartheid and institutional racism, we had trouble getting jobs. We still had trouble amassing wealth. But the co-ops gave us a little bit, right? A little bit of a cushion, a way to pool resources so that we could do as a group what we couldn't do as individuals, a way to accumulate some wealth, but more on a community level, not so much on an individual level. And so a way to survive marginalization, oppression, to feed ourselves, to house ourselves, to provide fair access to capital, to provide good jobs in more non-exploitative ways. And so I want to give you some examples, but as I said, I'm also in a minute going to give you some definitions of what co-ops are and how they operate, et cetera. The other general thing I want to say, next slide, is that there were barriers and challenges. I like to focus on the successes and the optimism that studying cooperative economics brings, but I don't want to, I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish. So, and we can talk more in the Q&A. One of the reasons the book is called Collective Courage is because it actually took courage to do alternative economics, right? It took courage both to practice economic behavior that wasn't the mainstream, but it also took courage because there was so much sabotage and violence against people, Black people who were engaging in co-op work. But the other barriers were education and continuous education, right? We live in a capitalist society which frowns upon economic cooperation and actually calls it names like communism and things like that. And so, you need education to even learn about that there are viable alternatives and how to operate and work under them. Continuous education is also important because you've got to keep training yourself in a democratic institution. You have to keep training yourself and train the new people who come in and educate, right? So it's a continuous process. There's access to capital issues, to equity that needs to be raised to put into the co-op, and as well as capitalization just for startups. But also the barriers, especially for African Americans, have been these financial economic sabotage and actual physical violence, white supremacist terrorism against co-ops. And so we've had to also learn how to protect ourselves, how to stay sort of under the radar sometimes. So one of the reasons why I also found that this history has been hidden is for that reason, because often you didn't talk about it. You didn't even tell your children about what you were doing because it was physically dangerous to do it, but it was also hard to do it because often banks wouldn't give loans or lines of credit, insurance companies wouldn't insurance, co-ops, transportation companies wouldn't transport co-ops, there was excessive competition. but also there was this threat to physical violence and lynching. So some co-op members got lynched, co-ops got burned down, etc. So the whole gamut of sabotage. And yet, next slide, you'll see I uncovered just a host of information about a continuous history of African-American co-op ownership and mutual aid from the early 1700s to the current period. And we're actually in a period now where worker co-ops especially, but co-ops and mutual aid are thriving again and flourishing again, partly out of need and partly because of ideology. So let's look at the bright side. What did co-ops accomplish for Blacks? Pooling resources, right? So especially when resources were scarce or meager, being able to pool them so that the pooled resources can help more people, providing quality goods and services and access to appropriate goods and services, saving costs, increasing income and wealth, combating exclusion and discrimination and marginalization, increasing Black economic stability and self-sufficiency, group interdependence and independence and self-determination, saving and creating decent jobs, developing collective agency and action on an economic side, and developing leadership. So there's both market and non-market benefits. Next slide. And I guess this might be a little bit redundant, but again, the benefits are addressing the market failures and the marginalization, creating joint ownership, democratic participation, education and training, leadership development, meaningful work, anchoring and recirculating resources in communities, creating actual wealth, right? The equity owned in a co-op business is wealth for its members and sometimes community wealth for the community. Economic and environmental sustainability. So especially as, you know, these times, I forgot to put that on our list of what the 21st century challenges were, you know, environmental degradation and climate change. Co-ops also help to address that sustainability and environmental sustainability. And even civic participation, we have data and information about people who are involved in co-ops get used to that kind of level of democratic involvement and start to demand it in other aspects of their life and start to practice it in other aspects of their life. So how did Black communities sort of get to that place where co-ops are able to give these kinds of benefits? Well, one of the things I also noticed as I started to do the research was that throughout the efforts for civil rights, right, from the first days, again, that we were brought to North American soil from Africa, we resisted enslavement and oppression, we fought for our own freedom, and again, we fought for survival in dignified, humane ways, which, you know, is sort of economic democracy. That's what I call the long civil rights movement, and if you study it, you realize it's not just about civil rights and political rights, policy and voting, but it was also about these, you know, asserting economic rights and economic agency. So the pursuit of economic alternatives is part of the struggle and resistance. And really, when you tell the African-American co-op history, many of the players are even the same as those who became famous for their civil rights activity. So in a different speech, sometimes I start to just name off people that you know, W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, Marcus Garvey, and all of them, you know, John Lewis, they all actually had a role to play in the Black co-op movement as well as the official civil rights movement. Next slide. And so some people got their start in the co-op movement, like Ella Jo Baker, who you know more for SNCC and SCLC and the 50s and 60s civil rights movement, but in the 1930s, she actually was one of the co-founders of the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And I argue that's where she actually learned a lot of her ideas about grassroots leadership development and things like that. And again, we could name other Black leaders, similar case, who were very involved in co-op movement before their political involvement, or somebody like a Fannie Lou Hamer, who gets involved in co-ops after her political activity. She realizes how limited the political activity is, and that you can be thwarted by your thwarted in your political activity because economic sabotage against you, and economic retaliation against you, and also that being able to vote, but still not having any food, not having good care for your children, not having a house to live in, right? Being able to vote isn't the end all, that we also need those economic rights and economic justice. So throughout history, we have Black leaders who are pointing out and talking to us about how important the co-op movement is, and co-op, cooperative ownership and cooperative economics is, even though it's also been dangerous to talk about it. Next slide. So just to give you two ideas of sort of how Black leaders have talked about it, someone you probably don't know, Helena Wilson, who was actually for about 30 years, she was president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You probably know the Brotherhood, the first official Black independent 20th century labor union, headed and founded by A. Philip Randolph. What you don't know is that the Ladies Auxiliary was a very powerful, very active group, and that their president, Helena Wilson, was a co-op educator and a co-op developer. And one of the things she said in one of the articles she wrote in the Black Worker, I think it's the Black Worker, which was the BSCP's magazine, she said, "No race can be said to be another's equal that cannot or will not protect its own interest. This new order can be brought about once the Negro acknowledges the wisdom in uniting his forces and pooling his funds for the common good of all." So back to that notion about the common good, pooling our funds, right? We're doing this all together because, right, we're strong. We're only as strong as all of us together. And we're only, we can only succeed together. And then another quote by Du Bois, next slide. In 1933, he wrote in the Crisis magazine, "We can, by consumers and producers' cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx." So think the language, right? We've got the common good, right? All of us together, producer and consumer cooperation, progressively self-supporting economy, so we don't have to depend on others. We don't have to be discriminated or exploited by others, right? And then the majority, wielding the majority of us, right? So again, it's about the whole group, not individuals, into an impregnable economic phalanx. And this is, right, economic cooperation can do that for us. Next slide. So what is a cooperative? After I'm saying all this great stuff about what co-ops have achieved and who's been interested in them. So they are, they're businesses, they're enterprises, they're member-owned, member-run, and member-serving businesses. They're values-based, jointly owned enterprises that operate according to principles of membership, democratic governance, returns based on economic participation, sustainability, and care for community. They can be for-profit or not-profit, which confuses people a lot, but a co-op can choose, or depending on which kind of co-op law you operate under. And in a minute, we'll talk more about different kinds of co-ops, but like a credit union, which is a cooperative bank, all the US incorporation laws, all the credit unions are not for profit. But most worker co-ops where the employees own the company are actually for-profit companies, though profit motive is not the major mission of the cooperative. And in a minute, we'll talk about the profit motive versus being for-profit. Next slide. So what does it mean to be a values-based business, to value economic democracy? It means that economic decisions and activity are people-centered, not centered on profit maximization. It means that there's a grassroots economic framework based on solidarity and cooperation underneath these businesses. There's reduced hierarchy and dominance in economic relations. We have what's called one member, one vote instead of one share, one vote. In a minute, I'm going to go over that in more detail, so that multiple voices are heard and multiple stakeholders participate equally, right? Money doesn't dominate. And this sense of solidarity with members and with communities, so that the returns are to the community, right? Back to that group process. So that's what we mean by a values-based business. Next slide. There's actually a very strong international cooperative community, which I think Professor O'Connor mentioned already, and there's 7 international principles of cooperation. Just quickly, open and voluntary membership, that democratic member control, members' economic participation, meaning the returns are for the use of the co-op, not to the investment, autonomy and independence, education, training, information, and continuous education, open book, meaning, right, in order to have democratic governance, everyone needs to be able to see what's being spent, where the money's coming from, where it's going. So also this open book goes into that training and information. Then cooperation among cooperatives. So cooperative businesses pledge to help and support each other, and concern for community. Cooperatives also have that principle and value of trying to give back to community, being in solidarity with community, trying to be supportive of the communities that they're in. There's been some discussion of introducing an 8th principle. Some people think it should be about sustainability, but others think that sustainability already fits under concern for community. And then other people are saying that there should be an 8th principle about racial justice. So the international community is actually now talking about how to bring sustainability and racial justice into these principles. And we'll see, they have evolved over time, so they could keep evolving. Next slide. Joint ownership means pooling of resources, leveraging the pooled resources, reducing individual risk, but profit sharing, right? So you reduce risk and increase the ability for profits, anchored in community, and addressing low income capital flight issues, lack of experience, because again, it's sort of no one person has to know everything or has to put in all the money or whatever, right? So everything is kind of shared, both the good and the bad. And 2 heads are better than one kind of notion of joint ownership and joint decision making. Next slide. So there's about 4 major types of cooperatives. Consumer cooperatives, which help consumers to pool their resources to gain access to needed goods and services, to buy in bulk, affordable prices. So food co-ops are usually consumer-owned. Credit unions are consumer-owned. Banks, financial institutions, buying clubs, housing co-ops are essentially consumer-owned or resident-owned. Producer co-ops are those where it helps the members to process and market their goods themselves collectively and more efficiently. So agricultural producer cooperatives like Land of Lakes, right? The dairy farmers who are the members of Land of Lakes own the processing company to make the cheese, the butter, the milk. And again, so that all the dairy farmers that are members own and control and decide what happens at the production and the marketing phase. Craft co-ops are also producer co-ops. So a quilting bee like the one in Alabama that started in the 60s, right, where the women quilt together and sell the quilts together. The co-op helps them to facilitate all that. They were able to buy land and build a sewing factory. And then because the women weren't working out of the home anymore, they needed daycare. So the co-op set up a daycare center and an after school program and a summer program for the kids. So that kind of thing are producer co-ops. And then they're worker co-ops. These are totally owned by the employees of a company and governed democratically, so that you can get better working conditions and pay, and again, better control over your company, your business. And then there's hybrid, what some people call solidarity co-ops. That's where consumers and workers, or some combination, sometimes it's community and workers, or producers and workers, but usually consumers and workers own the co-op together. And therefore, again, you have a multi-stakeholder relationship. Next slide. So just quickly, the difference between a cooperative and a sort of investor corp or a regular not a regular business, is the members are owners as opposed to investors being owners. There's one member, one vote in a co-op instead of one share, one vote. So you don't have the tyranny of the people who have the most money to start with, having the most votes. Cooperatives have a different mission, right? It's satisfying a need, problem solving, creating accessible, affordable goods and services, whereas investor stock corps, it's the profit motive. In cooperatives, capital is subordinate to labor and to usage, as I mentioned before. And the investor stock corp, capital is supreme and capital rents labor. So it's all about capital. Cooperatives, it's democratic governance and democratic participation. On the investor side, it's majority money rule. And finally, again, the value is about solidarity and community and returns to community and returns to the group, right? In investor stock core, it's a returns to the owner, to the investors. Next slide, please. The last thing you should know about co-ops, or I guess the second to last thing, is that they have lower failure rates than small businesses, better longevity than traditional corporations, especially small businesses, which are very precarious. After the first year, only about 10% of co-ops fail, whereas 60 to 80% of small businesses fail. After 5 years, about 90% of co-ops are still operating versus only 3 to 5% of traditional businesses. So you would wonder why people really haven't resonated to this model, since it's a much stronger model. But remember, we're kind of ruled by ideology and the powerful. And we don't learn about these, right? We don't learn about co-ops, so we don't know all this. We also have evidence that co-ops successfully address the effects of crises, so they survive crises better, and they also often are started during crises, because during crises people actually see how the other models are failing, and they go back to sort of what's the most human thing is to share and to work together, that kind of thing. But they also survive crises better because they're much more flexible business model. Next slide. And the last thing to say about co-ops, which actually it took me a while to learn. When I first learned about co-ops in the 90s, no one talked about African American or Black co-ops. No one talked about co-ops in Africa. People barely even talked about Indigenous, First Nations co-ops. It was all about the Rochdale pioneers in Britain in 1844. Being the start of the whole co-op, worldwide co-op movement, and that co-ops are kind of European. We had European examples. But it turns out the more you study co-ops and the more you look through history, that we know that every population in US history have used cooperation, economic cooperation, and have had co-ops in every continent of the US, in every era, in every continent of the world, in every era. The notions of the common good, the commonwealth, collectivism, what we call in the Kwanzaa principles, collective work and responsibility, right, have all permeated different societies and humanity, right? Cooperatives are actually an earlier form of economic activity than capitalism, and then even than feudalism, right? We know that indigenous cooperative efforts from First Nations and early African civilizations. And we know, at least in the US, mutual aid associations, revolving loan funds, and rotating savings and credit have been sort of the precursors to formal co-op businesses. Next slide, please. So now I just want to give you a few examples, and then I'm looking forward to the conversation. Next slide, please. So the first one I want to start with is the 1880s, because it's a really interesting period of time. It's actually similar to the time we're in now in terms of backlash, racial backlash after Reconstruction, the rise of white supremacist violence and the Ku Klux Klan, hard economic times, and yet lots of grassroots economic activity and cooperation and cooperatives thriving. It's a period of time when populist movement, the labor movement, and the co-op movement are all kind of growing up together. And so the unions are also doing co-op development and talking about worker ownership. The populist organizations that want, land for everybody and want civil rights for Blacks and stuff are also working with labor. So they want laborers to own their own land, but until they can own their own land, to have supportive labor laws and stuff. And then they're all talking about farmers co-ops and worker co-ops, et cetera. Really fascinating period of time when you study it from that perspective. And we see that the early labor unions were really helping to develop worker cooperatives, urban and rural, which is another really interesting thing, and doing what they were calling credit exchanges, so that precursors to credit unions. So that there was better access to credit for people who wanted and were able to get land, but also better rights for workers. Next slide. And those movements were actually all integrated, at least the most progressive of those movements were integrated or fighting to be integrated, so blacks and whites. So we have the Knights of Labor, organized in the early should be the early 1880s to the early 1900s. Sorry about that typo. The Knights of Labor was an integrated, very radical union throughout a lot of the South and some of the northern cities. Between 1886 and 1888, so a 2-year period, they organized 200 industrial co-ops. So you can see the kind of the fervor of the activity that was happening. They also promoted women's leadership and Black leadership. And as I said, even though in many of the southern states, Blacks and whites couldn't be in the same chapter, they had to have parallel chapters. They still had parallel procedures, policies, and platforms that they were working on through the Knights of Labor. Same thing with the Cooperative Workers of America around the same period of time. They were focusing on starting co-op stores. They wanted free cooperative school system. They worked on issues of wages and work control, electoral reform, and they used Black organizers and connected the movement to Black Baptist and Methodist churches with union leagues. So two progressive labor movements that were actually integrated. An example of what was happening with the Knights of Labor, 1885 in Richmond, Virginia, they started the Working Men's Reform Party, and they ran a platform that year to take over the Richmond City Council, because the current members of the Richmond City Council were planning, if they won the election, to rebuild the Richmond City Hall, which had been burned down during the Civil War, hadn't been rebuilt yet, but they were planning to rebuild it with convict labor. So the Knights of Labor had a huge campaign because they didn't want the City Hall to be built with convict labor. They wanted it to be built by free labor, Black and white labor, women, and co-ops. And so that was the platform they ran on. They actually won control of the city council and were able to hire racially integrated unionized local workforce that included women. They rebuilt the city hall without convict labor. So another example of a great, right? So that's the economics with the politics. And somebody needs to mute themselves. Next slide, please. Next slide. Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union also was around the same period of time, was formed to aid Black farmers and farm workers. So this was a purely Black co-op and union and progressive organization. They started co-ops and exchanges throughout the South, but faced fierce KKK, white supremacists, violence, and vigilantes, but were basically the largest, next slide, the largest Black organization of its period, with probably over 1 million members. We don't know how many because so many of the chapters had to go underground, but the estimates are there were over 1 million members. And so another interesting thing I found was a lot of strong Black organizations were promoting co-ops, and a lot of places where there was the most co-op activity, it was because there were strong Black organizations like the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union. Let me keep moving because I think I have like 5 minutes left. I forgot to ask for a 5-minute warning. I'm probably past that already, right? So let's go, next slide. I'll go into the 1930s. The 1930s were a prolific period of time. Another one, actually, the 1880s was pretty prolific for Black co-ops. The 1930s and 40s was another time. This time, because of the Great Depression, right? So survival needs, people reverted to co-ops, but also the New Deal actually had a self-help co-op division in the Department of Commerce and was supporting Black and white co-op development. But before the New Deal started supporting co-ops, we had the Young Negroes Cooperative League, which started in 1930. George Schuyler, from a Black columnist in the Pittsburgh Courier, sends out in one of his columns, he calls on young Negroes to save the race by engaging in economic cooperation, that the old trodden ways that we were trying of becoming capitalists wasn't working, and we should be embracing cooperative economics and starting multiple interconnected co-ops regionally and nationally. In 1930, December of 1930, he and Ella Jo Baker and about 25 other Blacks youth found the organization. They hold annual conferences. Their first conference the next year in Pittsburgh had 600 people in attendance. This is 1931. 600 people came to Pittsburgh, Black folks, to inaugurate the Young Negroes Cooperative League. Their goal was to form coalitions of local cooperatives and buying clubs, affiliated into networks and affiliate councils, regional and then national. They wanted 5,000 charter members paying $1 each, so then they would have $5,000 to do co-op education and co-op development with. Next slide. By 1932, they had councils throughout New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, since New Orleans, South Carolina, Virginia, Washington, D.C., with about 400 members. And they developed co-op stores in places like Harlem and Buffalo. Next slide. They also believed that control of the organization and control of co-op should be in the hands of young people and women. And Ella Baker at the first national conference, actually her speech is about Black women in the co-op movement and that role. It's another finding I have in my book of how important Black women's roles were in the Black American co-op movement. But unfortunately, Ella Baker's speech doesn't, I couldn't find her speech. So all I know is that she made the speech about that topic, but I don't have a copy of her speech. But it turns out she was quite prophetic, because before and after her speech in 1931, I found lots and lots of examples of Black women's leadership in the co-op movement. Just have a couple more examples left to wind up. Next slide. Gary, Indiana, also during the Great Depression, the Consumers Cooperative Trading Company starts. Actually, they had another name at the beginning, but in 1935, they named themselves Consumers Cooperative Trading Company, and they open a retail grocery co-op. Within a year, it's considered the largest grocery business operated by African Americans. They also spent a year before that studying and putting cooperative economics in the high school, the Black night school at the high school, so that people could learn about cooperative economics. They opened a credit union, a gas station, and a second branch of the grocery store, all within 3 years. And the grocery store is even able to pay dividends back. So that's why I also talk about wealth accumulation with co-ops. Next slide. Similarly, in Chicago, a little bit later, by the end of the 30s, we have the residents of the Rosenwald Apartments of Chicago boycotting a local food chain that was discriminating against Blacks. And they start a study group, a buying club, and then open up a retail store. The team is actually advised by the group in Gary, Indiana, that we just talked about. Their store opens in July of 1937. They then have a credit union that September and a meat market, and double the size of the store by 1938 and distribute dividends. So again, you see how a lot of these groups start with an idea, do some studying, and open one thing, then open another kind of co-op, then expand their co-ops because of need, and because it makes sense once you start cooperating to try to do more and more of what you're doing cooperatively. Next slide. I'm going to skip the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I mentioned them a little bit earlier, but you can ask me about them in the Q&A if you want. But both A. Philip Randolph and the Ladies Auxiliary were very strong about co-op development and keeping union money recirculating in the Black community through cooperative ownership. Next slide. Black Panther Party. You might not know this, but they were also practicing economic cooperation. They were an intercommunalist organization. Their survival programs were mostly community development programs that were based on cooperative bakeries, free health clinics, free pest control, free transportation services for the elderly, and to drive people to visit their families in prison. They also did the free breakfast program, which we do know about. They also practiced communal cooperative housing, and they ran their newspaper as a cooperative, even though it was a money-making scheme. And the last two examples are the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which became, it still exists, it's about 52 years old now, 51 years old, became a Southern Regional Co-op Development Association run by African Americans, started basically by all the major civil rights organizations who came together for a meeting in 1966 and agreed that there needed to be a regional support system for co-op development. Even though they did that quietly, publicly they were more talking about civil rights and voting rights, but quietly they came together to agree that we needed to practice cooperative economics, and we needed a Southern Regional Association to support that. They got money from the Ford Foundation and from the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, and were able to start the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which then became the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, because it merged with the Emergency Land Fund project, and is also about protecting Black land ownership as well as promoting Black co-op development, organic farming, agriculture processing, fishing, sewing co-ops, etc., and protecting Black land. Next slide, please. Oh, and I was supposed to now tell you about merging with the Land Assistance Fund. Next slide. Movement for Black Lives, hopefully you all know, but their platform in 2016 started to emphasize economic justice and included cooperative development. So I also wanted to highlight similarities between the Black Lives Matter and the Black Panther Party, right? They ostensibly are starting out as against police brutality, but they're moving into cooperative economics and economic justice issues because they realize it's all intertwined. We can talk about that a little bit more. Next slide. In the Q&A. And I want to end with youth co-ops. Next slide. Because I think that's really our future, is getting young people involved in co-op development, even as early as middle school. We're finding that youth co-ops in schools even are helping to teach business skills and industrial specific skills, but also helping to motivate kids to stay in school, to learn their math, to learn reading and writing better. Helps them develop relationships with adults, address community problems, and generate income and savings while they're doing all that. So one example is Food from the Hood in LA in the 1990s, Crenshaw High School. They had they started out with a school garden, tried to think of what to do besides just giving the food away. They started selling the produce in farmers markets, and then they started learning business development and realized that if they did some production, right, actually made something did value added, they could get more money. So they started making salad dressing using the ingredients they grew in the school gardens. And they ran that business, salad dressing business, as a co-op run by what they call student managers, who voted that 50% of their profits would be saved for student scholarships to college. So when they graduated from high school, they could afford to go to college. They actually sold their salad dressing through the very fledgling Amazon internet, right? Because they knew they couldn't just sell enough if they just sold it out of their homes or out of the school, at the school events. So they used the Amazon platform very early on in the 1990s. In their first 10 years, they awarded $180,000 in college scholarships to 77 of their graduating student managers. And so you can see again how the co-op really helped them do a bunch of stuff: address community problems, stay in school, make enough money to go to college. The high school ended up starting a college prep program because now they had students who were able to go back to college. They started training younger kids on how to run the co-op so that when they graduated, there would still be succession and the co-op would keep going. And it went on, I guess, for about 15 years. So another great success story. Toxic Soil Busters, which still exists today in Worcester, Massachusetts from the 2000s. Youth Entrepreneurship and Management Project out of Worcester Roots, which is a nonprofit community organizing group. They started studying environmental justice and lead poisoning and learned how to do lead abatement landscaping, and so started their company, Toxic Soil Busters, right, to get the lead out of the soil. They learned about marketing, right, because they needed to explain lead poisoning issues, the soil lead poisoning issues to their communities and their families. They started doing skits and video production in order to let people know about the problem and about how they could fix it. And so they also ended up not just being a lead abatement landscaping company, but doing video production and other kinds of things. And another example of young people, you know, this was not an in-school project, but out of school project, but it also helped the young people to develop leadership, stay in school, and go on to be sort of community activists. So to sum up, right, we see that co-ops can change lives, can change communities, especially by providing more control. Worker co-op businesses especially, right, are emerging in healthcare, childcare, temporary services. They're leading their sectors and changing the nature of work. They're increasing returns to work, providing ownership for African Americans, women, youth, immigrants. There's lots of great examples, which I didn't give, of worker co-ops, sorry. But we saw that the other co-ops also, right, the consumer co-ops changed lives. We could say the same thing with the housing co-ops, which I didn't focus as much about, but I know we're going to talk about them in a minute. Next slide. Also, I mentioned community and organization matter, right? Focused on community, supporting community, and having community support all made a difference throughout our history. And when a lot of the co-ops were being sabotaged and preyed upon, it was the community support that helped them to survive or helped them to regroup into something else. And finally, education matters. Almost every co-op that I've found in history started with, every Black co-op started with a study group. Many of them started from religious institutions out of other schools, or just people coming together and studying together what their problems were and what a co-op business is. And keeping the education going so that all the new members have the same education, so that young people have education, so that when they go to a co-op, it's not an alien concept to them. So all aspects of education matter in keeping co-ops going. And we also found that Black leaders and writers were promoting co-op education and talking about co-ops in all kinds of formats, speaking lectures, magazine articles, news articles, etc.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Please join me in applauding that wonderful, incredibly rich, and actually just opened up so much for conversation. I especially appreciate the fact that you ended on a note of both youth and education, because really that's exactly what we're all about right now. So what we're going to do now, we've invited a panel to really just to help us to launch a broader conversation. We have three people who are going to be raising thoughts, but directing questions to you. Well, I will introduce them now and then turn to them. And after that, we'll be having general Q&A. So please do submit your questions into the chat box so that we can convey them. Okay, so our panelists will start with Elvia Cruz Garcia, who is a recent UCSB graduate who was a major in environmental studies, and she shouts out in her bio that classes like The World in 2050 and Built World and the Environment have been huge inspirations for her. We love to hear this as professors, and have invited her to reimagine how our communities can work together, and to reimagine how they can work together and build resilience in the face of climate change. She's been doing that work herself through her work with EcoVista and Cooperation Santa Barbara. Marcelina Sepulveda is the executive director for Santa Barbara Student Housing Cooperative, and he's a board member of NASCO Development Services. He is currently active as well in the Cooperation Santa Barbara movement, which is a local mutual aid organization that advances economic democracy here in our area. And he also DJs and manages the Santa Barbara Dance Tribe, which is a local ecstatic dance community organization. His own professional experience has been in labor, union, and community organizing, and he is passionate about sociocratic shared governance praxis. And he is a faith-based social, economic, and political justice activist. Christopher McCauley is Associate Professor of Black Studies here at UCSB. Chris teaches courses on the Caribbean, on Black radical thought and race in North American society. And his most recent book, The Spirit versus the Souls, Max Weber, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the Politics of Scholarship, was published in 2019. So we're going to ask each of our panelists in turn to raise questions and offer comments to Jessica, starting with Elvia.
Hi, thank you so much for coming over. I love the presentation and I got really inspired. And my question is like, is there anyone that isn't historically talked about that inspire you based on their work towards creating co-ops and stuff? Because yeah, I would love to like get to know more about someone that inspired you when you were doing your research.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I was inspired in a bunch of different ways. As you see, you know, I quote Du Bois a lot. When you read him for his economics, it's a very different read than when you're reading his politics and history. So I got very inspired by his excitement that economic cooperation could really be the thing that liberates African Americans. But I think you might have been asking about sort of people that I met or people in my life rather than people that I read. And so I think what I would say about that is as I started getting involved in this movement, and I especially got involved in the worker co-op movement, there were a bunch of women, Black and white, who were worker owners that really inspired me because of all the hard work and the leadership they provided in starting their co-ops and continuing the co-ops. And the way that they sort of, how should I put it? I mean, they're the ones who sort of really put the meat to the values-based business model, right? So you can study it intellectually, right? And I read you all the stuff, right? It's values-based. It believes in, you know, different voices and multi-stakeholder voices and people having, you know, being more cared about than profits and stuff. But until you actually meet the people who this is happening to, one of the women, a Black woman in the co-op peep show called Lusty Ladies in San Francisco. It's now, unfortunately, it folded a few years ago. But so dancers, right? They're exotic dancers in a peep show in the Mission, is it the Mission area of San Francisco? I don't know San Francisco that well. And she actually came to a workshop I gave as I was talking about some of the history I was uncovering. But at that workshop, she started talking about what it was like being a Black woman in a worker co-op peep show. Right. And one of the things she did, and then I interviewed her later and she reiterated this, was what a different life it was being a worker owner in your own company. When she was in a non-worker owned peep show, first of all, as a Black woman, she was a marginalized dancer. So they never let her dance in the single window. And, you know, I hope I'm not divulging too much to anybody who doesn't care about this stuff, but the single windows are where you make the most tips because it's just you and the viewer, and you do mostly what they want, and they keep putting money in, and you get tips. But they didn't let Black women dance in those windows. They could only dance in the group windows, and so they never made as much money as the dancers who got to dance in the single windows. Once you became in the co-op made sure everybody, right, they rotated who got the window, the single window, right? Everybody got the same wage, basically. They also rotated, it was extremely democratically run co-op. So they actually rotated the manager positions. Every 3 months, they voted on who from the membership would be the managers. The other thing that's actually really fascinating about Lusty Ladies was it was not just owned by the dancers, it was also owned by the bouncers and the janitors. So it was a really interesting combination of owners, but the women dancers rotated the manager positions. And they did it partly because they got paid a little bit more because they had more responsibility, but they also did it because it was such an exhausting job, apparently, that this was a way to divide, not exhaust everybody and divide it up. So that kind of thing really inspired me. Women in cooperative home care associates, home care workers who normally would have very precarious, bad paid jobs, just talking about being in a union and how much being able to weigh in on what the work rules were going to be and what kind of benefits they get and that kind of thing. It just makes such a huge difference in their lives.
Great. Thank you. Marcelino?
Hi, Jessica. This is so exciting. And I really appreciate how you clarify that co-ops are businesses, because we often think about cooperatives as the mutual aid society side of the cooperative, and we don't take into account that it's actually a business. And I'm curious what skill sets the early African American cooperative business owners discovered were needed in order for their business to really survive for the long term. And because as a business, a cooperative is also really unique in terms of how decision making is made. And yet the financial practices still have to report to regulating agencies. We're still subject to the factors of capitalism as a business, and then we're trying to build this culture of inclusivity and accountability, not just to our members, but to the forces of capitalism around us. So I'm just curious, what skill sets would you say are really valuable for a cooperative enterprise to have on board in order to ensure its sustainability for the long term?
Right. Great. Another great question. So in addition to finding that pretty much every Black co-op I found out anything about started with some kind of study group, it also became very clear what kinds of things they needed to study. So at first they were just studying in general, right? What is a co-op, and right, how do you do it? But you'll see, like the Gary, Indiana group, they ended up having 2 different courses in the night school that they promoted on cooperative economics. One was just kind of an introduction. What's cooperative economics? How is it operated in history, right? How do you start a co-op, right? But the second one was co-op management, co-op democracy and co-op management. So they also recognize that there's something different about how you manage a co-op, how you manage yourselves, how you operate together. And so they had a second, more advanced course on the management side. And it turns out, I think that I would say, especially with the current research I've done, that that's one of the biggest things, like how do you really democratically, right? What is either self-management or democratic management? What does that look like? How do we do it? How do we manage it? So then you need to know not just sort of how to do the business, right? Not just how to sew the quilt or how to make cheese or whatever, or how to do the home care, how to lift somebody who's wheelchair bound or whatever. But there's also these things about how do you make decisions together? And it turns out the strongest co-ops also pay a huge amount of attention to those kind of things. So conflict resolution, or now we call it conflict transformation, right? You're not just resolving conflict, but you're transforming it into something more powerful, right? Connecting and addressing differences and different ways of doing things to make, to come out with a consensus for how to do it, right? What does consensus mean? And does consensus mean some people have to just swallow it and say, okay, or does consensus mean you really talk things out and come to a better collective decision, right? How do you make people who are conflict averse realize, how do people see that conflict is actually part of a way to make a group stronger, right? It doesn't have to be something we either shy away from or are afraid of, or that would tear us apart, right? Or even democratic decision making, right? When I, as an economist, when I first started studying co-ops, right, all the traditional economic literature is like, oh, you can't run a business with collective voice. It takes too long, right? You need one person to just decide everything and keep everything going. And yet we found out, right, actually by the 21st century, most of the most dynamic, regularly run businesses are very cooperative and collective in terms of whose voices get heard and how they make decisions or whatever, because it turns out it's stronger when you involve people in the decisions and you have good ways to make the decision. So all those kind of decision making, how do we practice democracy? Things turn out to be really important. That's why, starting with when people are young is so important, because then they can get used to, this is the way to make decisions. This is the way we talk to people. This is the way we resolve conflict. This is the way we put two heads together to come up with a better solution, a better answer. So I would say that's kind of the major thing. But you do also, to be a dynamic, strong business, you need to also make sure that every member knows the business, whatever the industry is that you're in. You also need that level of training too. So kind of the parallel training.
Mhm.
And then the final secret is, you do have turnover, you do have new members, you do have people who retire, whatever. You've got to keep up that level of training and orientation and learning together, right? You have to be a learning organization. So you have to keep it up, because every new person that comes in, every time something changes, everybody has to be in it together and keep learning together.
Yeah. That's kind of a critical and really inspiring insight in a lot of ways. So, Chris.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you for doing the work you're doing and for having written Collective Courage. And also, I'm embarrassed that I didn't know your work until rather late in the day, because I feel like I would have written everything I wrote about Du Bois would have been fundamentally different. And now I feel like I got everything wrong, And so now I want to pull the book back and take it off the shelf.
It's all right. There's Du Bois has lots of iterations.
Yeah, but at the same time, to your point about, his political writing being very different from his economic writing, I wish I had even those words. I think would have been so helpful. And in reading your work, you just made me understand or rethink not only Du Bois, but our mutual dear friend Clyde Woods. Clyde's work, which resonated when I first read it, but boy, after reading your work, I really feel like I've got to go back to Clyde. And then I was so happy to see that in one of your slides, you wrote down Susu, because that's how it is that I first knew what I later, I came to understand as cooperative work. But this was what my godmother, and a number of her, good girlfriends were involved in for many, many years. But this, I guess, all of this gets to a misunderstanding, or perhaps that I had, in kind of looking at cooperatives, which you would see referenced in passing, in the labor movement, among Black communities, other communities at certain crisis moments. But I never really thought about, unless somebody was a committed socialist or thinking along those lines, I never really thought about people sticking with the cooperative once it is that the cooperative had gotten them to a place of some sort of economic well-being, right? So the cooperative was the stepping stone to doing the individualist, bourgeois, whatever you want to call it, standard of achievement. And so I was just, I guess in a certain way, I was kind of wondering if, because it seems like there doesn't seem to be evidence for that. I mean, it was just kind of like some misattribution that I had, because what your work is showing is that once it is that people make the commitment to the cooperative, by and large, they're making the commitment to cooperative ways, cooperative thinking, cooperative interaction. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great questions. And first, I just want to say thanks for bringing Clyde Woods into the room.
Yeah.
A dear friend of mine who passed, but yeah, he's just phenomenal work. And I actually I still go back to him too, because he often talks about how, his blues epistemology, that you can also see blues as an economic, project, a way to understand that, what does he call it? The co-production of knowledge and the co-production of an ideal, right? And basically that's what co-ops are doing on the economic side. So I often in fact, I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about a theory of African-American cooperative development that brings that notion of that, the improv and the co-production on the economic side. So thanks. In terms of your question, I think it's both and. So I think there's still a lot of examples that people did use co-ops as a stepping stone. So when they had nothing, the co-op got them something, got them to a place where they could either stand on their feet or their community could stand on their feet, and then they moved on. So there is some of that. One example, I guess, maybe you don't need examples, but one example would be the Chesapeake Marine and Railway Shipyard from 1865, and it lasted 18 years. So what is that, 1883 or something? So that is an interesting story. Actually, Du Bois tells this story too, but I was also able to look it up from some other things. But the end of the Civil War, Maryland, it's in Baltimore, Maryland is enacting laws that say that Black skilled workers can't hire themselves. They have to work for a white business or a white skilled master, because apparently the Black skilled workers, especially in Baltimore and the shipyards, were better than the whites, and they didn't want the competition. So the state actually passes a law that says that Blacks can't work for themselves, right? So, and the white stevedores and caulkers are actually boycotting and striking at places that were hiring skilled Black workers. So the Black community actually creates a Black-owned co-op to hire Black stevedores and caulkers in their own shipyard. And they symbolically buy the shipyard. That's the same place that Frederick Douglass describes as having sat on the steps of that shipyard with a spelling book, teaching himself how to read after his master doesn't allow him to learn how to read anymore. So they buy that shipyard. And for 18 years, they run, basically a collective shipyard that actually hires Black and white workers eventually, and gets their workers in the union. So basically the co-op, after 18 years, has integrated the union, has shown that Blacks can run their own business, and has been able to hire over 200 stevedores and caulkers. But the ground rent gets raised on them. They can't afford to stay in business anymore. They disband, but every single one of their workers gets a job in one of the other shipyards and is a member of an integrated union. So technically the co-op did what its purpose was, right? Which was to make sure Black stevedores and shipyards could be in the union and could get decent jobs. And so it did that. And so in some ways, though 18 years is a long time to stay in existence, so it's not even like it was a short-lived sort of stepping stone, but you could see that, right? But then some of these other projects, not all of them last long as the same co-op, but the co-op momentum lasts. So that's what I really saw, is not so much that we have co-ops lasting 20 and 30 years, though some of them do. But what we have is people stay involved, right? And the leadership they develop, they continue to use that in other ways. So even in Ella Baker, right? So the Young Negroes Cooperative League only lasts about 4 years or so. She's executive director for all those 4 years, but after it's over, she becomes education director in another co-op in Harlem that she helped to start. By 1948, she's on the board of another co-op in Harlem. You know, by the time she's starting SNCC and all that, she's still talking about, you know, grassroots leadership development and that kind of thing, which is basically the, you know, a lot of the stuff she got from the co-ops. So you have a lot of people like that who just keep bringing the skills, the ideas to whatever project they do, whether it's another business project or other aspects of life or whatever. And so that's what I was trying to capture. And what I was happy to find, even though, as I said, it was hard to find it, you had to really dig deep to find these things. But when you looked, you could see, so that those kinds of retentions, not necessarily the same exact business, but the principles, the practices, the leadership, and that, you know, kind of bringing the whole community along kind of thing. That's what seems to last in different forms. The only other example I would say, which is a lot like what you were talking about, was the Mercantile Co-op in 1901 in Virginia. Now that one also lasts like 25 years or something, but the study that I found about that one talks about long-lasting impact on into the 1950s. So that would be like a 50-year impact. Again, the co-op itself, I think, finally ends in 1926 or something. But the impact that this guy Craig finds is, one, the standard of living for Blacks go up starting like in 1905, right? Which he can only attribute to the co-op and the things that the co-op was doing. In fact, that county that the co-op is in, the Black population is reduced, and the white population gets reduced and stagnates. The Black population in that county increases and does better. Reading and income level are better. They have a sense of cohesion, so that by the time you get to the 1950s and the Brown versus Board, remember, Virginia is one of those states where they rather close down the public school system than integrate, right? But again, that county that had that whole history of this co-op is able to fight that and create integrated schools, and right, you know, so anyway, he's able to kind of do a whole 50-year tracing of all the benefits and ways that the co-op strengthened that community and allowed it to do other things as time passed. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, those are all rich and wonderful questions, and I will acknowledge that we have a lot of other questions, and we actually are. I want to acknowledge that we're over time right now, but
oh, I'm so sorry.
No, this is not about you. This is about the issues. But for those who want to stick around, I can raise at least another set of questions, but I won't be able to raise all of them. And what I want to say to everyone is, including those who have to leave to do other things, to be continued. I mean, we are going to have Jessica with us for our workshop on Thursday, May 6th at 5 o'clock. And precisely the kinds of questions that have been coming up, these are exactly the kinds of things we want to talk about, especially all of these issues about ongoing study, but kind of the very specifics about how do you run and sustain a cooperative and what does it take. So for the last round, I do want to have some voice from the audience. I'm going to raise 3 of the questions, and I'm going to say you probably won't be able to answer all of them, but I want to at least get them on the table. And so one set of questions is from Katrina, who wants to ask you to expand a bit on the definition of the grassroots economy and how that structure lends itself to solidarity. And she would also like to know more about how the Black Panthers were involved, what forms of cooperative housing they were involved with. For Marcus, I have a question about what you mean by the quote, rule by ideology, that you referred to earlier on in your talk. And from Annalise, I have a question that has multiple parts, so I'm going to focus mostly on the question that she raises about alternative forms of currency and barter and non-monetary forms of exchange that grow out of African and other First Peoples cooperative models, and whether you care to comment about those. Again, that's a lot on the table and you might not be able to answer all of them, but this just suggests some of the flavor of what we will be able to talk about when the workshop comes around.
I can say a little bit something quickly about each one. I did kind of give long answers to the other questions, so sorry, I didn't mean to not have give time for the audience. I don't know why I thought we had another half an hour or two. I'm sorry about that. So quickly, the Black Panther Party housing, it was basically co-housing. I'm not sure how many actual co-op housing they started. They did a lot of what we right now would call like shared housing, just a bunch of people living together and sharing the costs kind of thing. But again, the notion was sort of you give up everything to be in the party, including living together, working together, right? Movement building together kind of thing. I have a little bit more about it in my book. And then also there's some sections of a book called For All the People by John Curl, which goes into more detail. And then somebody recently wrote a book about not the housing co-ops, the free health clinics. I think she wrote a whole book about the free health clinics, if you want to know about that. The grassroots economy, what I mean by a grassroots economy is grassroots meaning local people, right? Local people owning and running their own economic system. So sometimes we call it a cooperative commonwealth, meaning sort of all the pieces of the economy or have some kind are cooperative in some way. Like if you think about a worker co-op, so you go to work, you're a worker owner in your co-op. Your co-op uses the credit union as its bank, right? You use the credit union for your mortgage. The credit union also helps to start affordable housing, especially to support housing co-ops. You buy your food at a food co-op, and maybe even, buy your clothing from a clothing co-op, get your fast food from a co-op caterer, right? So that's one of the meanings we have of sort of a solidarity grassroots economy, right? So everything that you're doing is connected because you and your community residents are owning all the pieces and using them together, so that you can also have what they call co-op supply chains, right? The food that's sold in the food co-op is from farms that are in your neighborhood or connected to regional farms, or the parts that are being used in the mechanics co-op are made at a co-op engineering factory or something like that. So you're supplying interlocking supply systems and interlocking co-ops to sort of serve as much of your needs as possible. Now, obviously, it's not totally realistic right now, but it is something that a lot of us aspire to. And that's why we talk about sort of grassroots solidarity systems. Some of the solidarity systems don't actually have to be official co-ops. They can also be barter. They can be local currencies. They can be what we call gifting, right? I help you, you help me. And a range of sort of formal and informal collective and cooperative ways to operate an economy, so that we can think outside of that capitalist extractive box, right? And we're not trying to extract and exploit people. So sorry, I said I was going to be fast. So that's that one. The rule by ideology, again, just quickly, and we can talk about this next time when we're together, but right, it can go both ways. If we have the ideology of solidarity, right, then we're making all these kinds of collective economic decisions based on what's best for the whole community. What are these solidarity systems that are non-exploitative, et cetera? How do we want to, right? How do we want to operate as human beings, right? I often talk about our current economic system makes us leave our humanity at the door, right? When we enter that black box of a business, a capitalist business and stuff, we're not supposed to really be human, right? We're just supposed to be automatons and profit-making machines or whatever. But we're human beings, right? But if we connect to our economic agency as human beings, then that's where we build solidarity economies. But if we're taught, right, that if the ideology we're taught is that everything's better as an individual and you can't really run businesses unless you're cutthroat and trying to get a profit, then we won't think out of that box and we'll think that's the only way to do it, right? But if we get out of that ideology and switch how we think about things, then we can go back to that solidarity economy I was just talking about. And the last question, oh, I sort of talked about the alternative currencies. I don't actually know as much about alternative currencies as other people do, but again, it's a way to think about, right, getting rid of a price system and looking at the common good, right? And so again, using sort of alternative currencies as a way to have an exchange system based on gifting and bartering rather than an exchange system based on an exploitative work relationship. And so again, trying to kind of get out of the box of the exploitative relationships and do more humane exchanges that are more locally controlled. How about that?
Well, also, I appreciate the economy with which you were able to deal with questions, but I really appreciate the alternative economy that you present to us, like the alternative way of talking about economy and what an economy is all about, because that's part of what we're trying to imagine and move towards with this project. Charlie, I'm not sure if you wanted to have any parting thoughts, but my parting thoughts are thank you so much, and most important, to be continued. Watch this space, as in we will be sending out further information about the workshop on May 6th, and I hope to see you all again so that we can continue this great conversation.
Yes, I'll just echo what Alice has said. Thank you, Jessica, for that very inspiring beginning of a dialogue, and I hope of a long relationship to come between your work and yourself and this initiative for cooperative economics. I think of the many sources, many elements of inspiration. I think this point that we ended on just now, the need not only for new forms of economic activity, like you described, which aren't new, but expanded, and also the challenging of the naturalization of this. It's an educational project. That's what I like so much about your talk. It starts as education and then becomes an economic alternative. And this challenging of the naturalization of capitalist ideology of this system that we're stuck in, and partly because we don't imagine with enough creativity and energy the alternatives which are out there and people are practicing. And this project is about thinking, documenting, as following your lead, documenting other kinds of experiences, and in so doing, expanding our minds to think beyond what's become normalized and makes us believe that there aren't alternatives when there really are. So thank you for, even though it's late on your coast, and we appreciate immensely your energy and insight, and hope that next time, maybe not May 6th, but the next time after that, we can actually welcome you in person. Thank you so much, everyone, for being present.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody, for a great evening.